And you've just drawn a horse. Which one of these horses would you pick? How do you, when you walk into a competition and you know, if they give you a horse, it's one thing. That'll be a second conversation. But if you had the choice of picking one of these, what would you pick and why? I want to.
Number one, what's your favorite idea for a good dinner date?
Well, first.
Hey, hey,
Hey!
Hey, bartender.
I know the blonde one is pretty. Not Connor, the horse. I like the pretty one.
Oh, I see how it is.
Okay, serious picks here.
That is.
What would you pick
That
and
is as good as I get.
Okay. All right.
Standing.
So thinking about what we were, you know, the first thing I would do, let's pull a couple horses off to the side, and let's pull Ronan over here and face that way. So let's look at Ronan here. First off, he's a Arab draft cross. So what that's going to tell you is that you have the potential for either Arab movement or draft movement. And draft movement is going to be characterized usually as a pulling horse. So that's a horse that's going to be potentially fairly on the forehand. And Arab, not necessarily so much. They can come up and they can be a lot, quote, hotter horse. So you're looking at that, you're saying, okay, we have a draft Arab. What do we have predominantly there? And if you want a slower horse, you're going to be looking for one that displays more draft characteristics. If you like a hotter horse, if that's what you're used to riding, you'll want something with a little bit more Arab characteristic. The other thing that's going on, and you haven't seen it yet, but when you go over to the barn with Trey, is that he's talking about different seats for different horses. You know, he's talking about levels of seat where you have a centered deep, like a dressage seat, a seat where you put one leg out toward the target and you sit back on this sit bone, which is a very unbalanced ride. The other one is a standard 2-point leaning up against the cantle. And then the other one is his quote advanced fourth level is over what Chrissy was showing over your feet. So if you know, when you walk into it, if you know what your twist is, what your dominant leg is, and what kind of seat that you sit, it's going to affect the horse that you pick. If you're up in a 2-point and you're leaning against the cantle, you're not going to want a horse that's on its forehand, because that horse will be heavy in the shoulders, and you leaning up and forward to take your shot will end up putting more weight on the forehand. And if you're leaning forward, it's not going to be a solid seat. It's not going to be an independent seat. You're dependent on the cantle to hold you up. If you're sitting, if you're sitting back on one hip, you want a horse that's not really very well, that's not very sensitive. If you have a choice of polo ponies, that's not a horse that you want to pick if you're going to be back on one seat bone with one leg open, because those horses have been trained, they're just going to go off that way. They're going to, you're not going to keep that horse straight if that's the way you know how to shoot. If you have that fourth level, sit, over yourself, balance on the horse, nice and straight, that's going to work probably for more horses. But then you have to be a little bit more independent in your seat to do the rating, to be able to rate that horse the way Chrissy's talking. But when you don't know the training level, there's a few things that you can kind of look at on a horse that will, why don't you bring him over here, that'll give you some clues as to what's going on with him. And this is sort of based in the biomechanics of how a horse moves. So Roberta, why don't you bring him around here and then walk him straight away from us. And if we can kind of get close to the gate so that you can watch him move, and stop for a second. So one of the things that I run equine rehab and therapy, and so I work on sore horses, and I work on everything from Olympic level horses to backyard horses. And one of the things that is pretty universal is how a horse moves in his hips. Most horses, unless you've had a wreck, are sore on one hip than another. And it'll vary depending on how the rider rides, depending on what's going on with hocks and different things. But you can just run your hand down a horse and say, okay, this part of the back is doing pretty well. But I get up in here and all of a sudden, and especially back in here, and all of a sudden that's sore. I go down this left side and he's not as reactive. I go down that way, not such a big deal. I go that way, and he's got more coming up underneath him. And let's watch him walk away. Watch how the rise and the fall of the hips are. So the top line of the hip, which hip are you seeing go up more than the other?
I'd like to see him again, but it looks like the left-hand side.
Yeah, let's do it again.
What does tail carriage tell you?
I know, he's putting out.
Tail carriage, if you know the horse, can tell you quite a bit. If you don't know the horse and you know he has Arab in him, it might not tell you much. Okay, so what do we see in there?
The left side's coming up.
Yeah. Okay.
He seems to have a bit more swing in the left.
Yeah. So what's happening there is his left hip, it's hiking. You know, he's doing this, and he has to lift it up to get it forward. So that horse, if you're going along and you have a left twist, that horse has basically the opposite twist. If your twist is left, his left hip is high, he has the opposite twist. He's going to go this way easier. This is an unusual pattern. Most horses you see, why don't you bring that pony over, the POA. Probably 85% of the horses you see will have more the pony, bring him over here and walk him away from us, will have more the pony pattern. A nice energetic walk. What do you see in that pattern?
Yeah, he looks fairly even, yeah.
Look at, bring him back and turn him around.
Looks like a hitch in his left somehow.
So look from here, this should drop as much as it raises, and vice versa. And so let's watch that again. Okay, you need to get a little bit of impulsion going. He's just sort of dragging himself along there. A little bit more. And so go again with just a little bit more life in him. If you were looking at if you soft focus your eyes and you're not really trying to look at, calibrating things, and you look at how that's going, there's an actual amount of movement, but then there's also a movement through time, almost like a syncopation there. And what I see going on there is that right hip is kind of doing this. The left hip is moving. It's not as locked as the right hip in big horse, but it's not moving evenly. And this is a horse that if that will probably, especially at a canter or at a lope, will turn left easier than right. He's going to be a little bit right resistant. If you walked up and you turned that way, this would be a great horse for you. This would be a better horse for you than that horse. Because these are things that over time you can change, or adjustments will change that, but you don't have that luxury in a class. So you're looking at sort of what is, even though it may not be. If nothing else, I'd like you to take away from this that horses aren't symmetric and that you're not symmetric. I mean, that I say that as a blanket statement, but over the years that's pretty true. And it's not good or bad. It's just as long as you're aware of how your asymmetries are and how that interacts with the horse, you can either bring the amplitudes together to smooth out your ride, or if the amplitudes are, if your asymmetries are exacerbating his asymmetries, you're going to have not only a lot more motion in him, or a lot more, it could even manifest as behavioral problems. So when you go to get on a horse, you're going to have to worry about whether you stay on a horse or not, or whether he stays in the course or runs against something. So this guy is a lot more sore in this hip than he is in this hip. And it's, both right hips are sore in these horses, but the black horse, the left hip isn't moving very well. This horse, it is moving well, and so it'll show up as a little bit different movement in the horse. The other thing that if you see, why don't you bring Peaches over? Okay, why don't you pull him aside and let's watch her move. Let's watch her move away from the hay.
Very, very slowly.
Yeah.
Way.
Okay, so come on back and then pick a point like that post and walk straight toward the post. We were kind of weaving around. So what do you see there? But there's quite a bit of motion in both hips. So the horses that I would see as symptomatic are the ones that have one hip that's hiked and one hip that's not moving. Whereas with her, I would sort of not expect to see a lot of pain issues anywhere. I mean, this is sort of where, this is the asymmetry that she has, but it's not really pathological asymmetry. It's not causing any problems with her. She should be able to go both ways pretty evenly. I mean, what you saw there was a lot of motion, a little bit higher left, but still quite a bit of motion on both sides. So, I mean, this horse, I would imagine, would be pretty balanced.
So she's developed more muscle, or she's overdeveloped and underdeveloped, but both sides are moving, so it's not causing her to go.
Yeah, there's not an ouch here. So if you ask her to set back on her hind end and turn, she's going to be able to set back and pick up a right lead as easily as a left lead. So when you're going down a straight course, that's another issue to talk about. When you're going down a straight course, you should be able to decide what lead your horse is going to pick up. So how do you determine what lead you ask for when you take off on a run? Is it something that's conscious? Do you think about what lead you're asking for?
I do, because most of the time when I'm riding on a straight course, I just try to alternate. I try to make them work both leads. If there was a turn, I would be have them on the lead on that way.
In competition, in a Korean competition, there will always be a corner, and most Hungarian styles will be a bend either on the run in or the run out. There'll be a bend somewhere.
But you're not shooting on the run in or the run out.
No.
So it really doesn't, for your accuracy and for your shooting, it doesn't so much matter what lead you're on. I mean, going in and going out, it sure makes it easier on the horse if you're in the correct lead for their turn. But horses can also counter. I mean, they can go around a bend in the opposite lead. But when you're shooting, if you have, the other thing that will happen is that horse will have a rougher right lead than a left lead. And that horse would be just the opposite. So if you had picked up that horse, you just run your hand down it and you say, oh, damn, this hip's sore. I think I'm going to pick up a left lead because it'll be a smoother lead. The horse will go into it easier, but it'll also be a smoother lead when you're riding. So you have less motion that you're going to have to.
So if the right hip is sore, then on the left lead.
And the reason for that is that when you're going in a right lead, you're pushing off with your opposite hip, but you're supporting yourself with your inside hip. And so when this hip is sore, bringing it forward and down is tough. And so he's going to end up throwing himself a little bit more into that lead, and you get a egg beater kind of motion that happens, which is harder to shoot from than...
These two, weren't they both sore in the right hip?
They were both sore in the right hip, but this horse had quite a bit of motion in both hips.
Right.
That horse had less motion in his left hip than his right hip.
Even though the right was the sore one?
Even though the right was the sore one. So that horse still, because that left hip has less motion, you would probably want to pick up the right lead.
Because the left has less motion?
Yeah, I mean, the right's sore on both of them.
Yeah.
And if you see a horse that has motion in both, but you have something that's as sore, I mean, this is pretty different in his amount of ouch on this side versus the amount of ouch on that side. Yeah. The pelvis here is restricted, and the sacrum over here. So you've got two different points that are going on. This horse will have a lot harder time on the right lead. This horse has asymmetry, but it's not as pronounced as that horse. So if you look at this, yeah, do you want to come in and hands-on and kind of get an idea of, these are really three great horses because they have three different issues going on. And the reason that I'm focusing today on the hind end is that that's your drive, that's your motor. And in a short period of time of getting to know this horse, that will probably tell you more than anything.
So tell us, just standing here, say we're going to pick a hand. How are we going to, what kind of pressure and how do you want us to come out there so we're kind of figuring out how to do it?
So the way I would look at that, every horse has a different level of sensitivity. You know, it's like you could walk up to a draft cross and go, and it would be okay. You walk up to an Arab and do that, and no matter what you do, they're going to go up and gone. It's like, whoa. So I usually start up in here, kind of get an idea of how much pressure. I put enough pressure to get a reaction out of them, and then I kind of back up. And then if I can get a bunch of areas that don't have reaction at a certain pressure, keep going down here, and then go down over the other side and I'm going to put a lot more pressure on just to get a reaction. That will do that. Then I know that this is relatively more sore than the rest of the horse. And every horse that you put your hands on will have a different threshold of what's okay for pressure and what's not. And you don't really care absolutely how much it is, you care relative to the rest of the horse. So that horse is a unique sample, and you want to know, relatively speaking, what's going on within that particular horse.
So when you're picking the lead, you favour first, if it's got mobility problems in one hip, then you'd favour that hip, and if both hips are mobile, then you'd favour the one that's more painful.
If both hips are mobile, and you have one that's more painful, that lead will be the rougher lead. Yeah. Because that's the supporting inside, when that becomes the inside leg that has to support himself so that the front end can come up and go out, that'll be the more difficult lead.
But if you've got one where you've got, say, as we had here, the right hip was painful, but the left hip, although not painful, was stiff, it will affect,
it affects what I do from a biomechanical point of view, but it probably won't affect you as much. As a rider, those things tend to even out.
The very lead would be the stiff one rather than
Yeah, I would if you got on that horse, I would think more about where your twist is and what, most people are more comfortable on the left lead. If everything being even in the horse, they're more comfortable on the left lead, more often than not, especially if you're shooting that way, because it's just, they're moving along. Although, the other thing that'll happen when you have a horse like that, what happens when the pelvis gets off is that this functionally becomes a short leg. That's the reason that you have a rougher ride. It's not the leg shortened, but the pelvis tilts, and all of a sudden you functionally have a shorter leg. As that comes around, in order to get it, he'll hike it up and bring it around like that, which is going to throw your right butt cheek up. So if you're sitting back in the saddle on your right cheek on horses that's the predominant pattern that you will see. I'll make that sweeping prediction because I won't be here to be contradicted. But that's the predominant, especially polo ponies, especially rodeo horses. If you get any of those kinds of horses anywhere, that's the pattern you're going to see.
Because they show the human-ridden in soreness more so than just their natural wear pattern.
And you're sitting back on your right hip, with that leg cocked out toward the target, you're going to get that motion. And if you have something that's sore like that, if you have something that's even, any of those four styles of riding will be pretty functional. If you have something that's really sore, it's better to be up and off of them. You'll have a better chance rating, you'll have a better chance getting anything done in a short period of time.
Because then you take the shock with your good balance position and your soft hip. You take the shock of whatever's coming up from the ground. You're going to take it rather than it transferring through you and then transferring out your arrow.
Theory is a great thing, but when you're looking at a horse and you have 20 minutes to figure it out, you need to look at what is and adjust to make your run the most, the easiest possible. What was that?